All right, let's go ahead and begin. Hello and welcome, everyone. Welcome to our panel on emerging voices in Asian American game studies, maybe Asian North American game studies, as we are Canadians as well as Americans. But hello and welcome. I want to start by stating that we're gathered here, some of us on, and all of us, including those joining us online, utilizing resources extracted from the traditional territories of the Arawandaren, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples, caretakers of the land since time memorial. In addition to acknowledging this fact and how we benefit from this ongoing colonial displacement, I hope that the ADE for Games Communities series of speakers and workshops, of which this event is a part, funded by a SHRC grant, generously supported by the Games Institute, and led by myself and Daniel Harley, I hope that this series of speakers and workshops will help move us towards concrete action for reconciliation. I hope this event in particular, as it takes place in the context of ongoing brutal and genocidal war in Palestine that has claimed more than 10,000 lives, can help us appreciate the solidarities that unite all oppressed and dispossessed peoples around the world, the solidarities that we must actualize in order to advance justice and struggle for lasting peace. By learning about and exploring how power, privilege are implicated in our professional lives and practices, we get closer to appreciating and actualizing these possibilities. In this context, I'm very pleased to introduce our event today, this panel on emerging voices in Asian American game studies. We'll hear from each of our three speakers, Sarah Ganzon, Juan He, and Matthew Howard, in the order in which they appear on the poster. I'll ask that if you have any questions as they're speaking, maybe you can put a note about that in the chat, and I'll put you down, and I'll make a question order for afterwards, and we'll save all the questions until all the speakers have had a chance to talk. Without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce Sarah Ganzon. Sarah is a assistant professor at Simon Fraser University in gaming, media, and communication. Her research revolves mostly around the areas of game studies and digital fandoms. Recently, she finished a thesis on Otome games in English and Otome game players. She holds a PhD from Concordia University in Communication Studies, as well as an MA in English Literature from Cardiff University. And prior to starting her doctorate, she taught courses in literature in the humanities at the University of the Philippines, University of Santo Tomas, and Far Eastern University. She's published in Games and Culture, Critical Studies in Media Communication, Human Technology, and the Journal of Transformative Works and Cultures. And today she'll be presenting new work, Mañanita on the Digital Islands, Animal Crossing, and the Junk Terror Bill protests. Thank you, Sarah.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen in a bit. Okay, it's this one, I think, and let me put it on slideshow. Current slide. There you go. Is it showing? Is it showing?
It is, yes.
It's okay, cool. All right, so without further ado, I'm really excited to present this work to you because this is one of my works in progress at the moment, and it's a thing that I started doing in the middle of the pandemic. I put it on hold a little bit to finish my dissertation, and now I'm back at it. So here you go. Today I'm going to be talking all about like how Animal Crossing has been used in protests, and also specifically how it's used in the Philippine context during the pandemic. And a lot of this work reviews a lot of the things that we've talked about how games intersect with politics. And of course, we have literature on it. Ian Bogost pretty much talks about how games is used alongside activism. And when he was talking about procedural rhetoric, a lot of his some early examples were there. And for better or for worse, like we have a lot of work on toxic technocultures in game studies, and like a lot of it has to do with Gamergate, but of course that sort of like draw our attention to not only toxic technocultures, but also how games are function in relation to public space, especially in conversations with identity. And of course, alongside that, there's the literature on the interchangeability of fandom and politics, and also the wider work on digital activism, but specifically on Animal Crossing. I'm happy to report that there's been work on it. Like for example, Nathan Rambukkana's work on distance sociality in Animal Crossing, which he presented in CJSA around like 2021, and I think this is still ongoing work. And in Chris Patterson's and Tara Fickle's like edited collection, there's Hannah Lee's work on the Hong Kong protests in Animal Crossing. So this is like really lovely to have work on this already, given the fact that it's been only a few years. But this is what I'll be discussing as well, but more specifically in the Philippine context. So just a little bit of a background when it comes to Animal Crossing New Horizons. Like it's a game that was released on the Nintendo Switch in March 2020, and this is like this is pretty significant because it was at the start of the pandemic. So people have been using like Animal Crossing to gather together, because it's a game wherein you could build stuff in your own islands. You could and you could also invite a bunch of friends to do stuff together. So Nathan has been writing about how people have been celebrating birthdays on Animal Crossing, and I remember doing a New Year's Eve celebration with friends on Animal Crossing. So there's stuff on that already. But one thing that I really want to focus on here is how Animal Crossing also pretty much showed us forms of sociality in the pandemic, specifically on the protests, because and this is what I want to focus on specifically, because this has Animal Crossing has been used for the Hong Kong protests, as pointed out, but it also pretty much had its use on multiple other protests that happened during the pandemic. For example, the Black Lives Matter protest, a lot of people were also using Animal Crossing. And also more recently, even after some of the lockdowns have been lifted, some of the Paris strikes actually last year, there were some players who were still using Animal Crossing. So there's a lot of conversations to be had here on how Animal Crossing has been used for protests. Now, in the Philippine context, there's it's the Junk Terror protest, which I'll be talking about, is not the first instance where it was used. The use of it started around March, especially when Rodrigo Duterte shut down a major Philippine news network because of because they were criticizing his regime. And this picture is pretty much my island, because there was a few folks who were using their islands to do protest banners and stuff, and also inviting other people who were protesting the lack of media freedom in the Philippines. Now, to give you a little bit of a context on that as well, this is because of Rodrigo Duterte's war on drugs that started in 2016, which killed thousands, particularly in a lot of less privileged communities, especially in what he was doing is he was sort of saying that, oh, drug addicts are like salot, or like he's pretty much saying that they need to be eliminated. So and he used his police to pretty much round up a lot of people, and there were mass arrests, especially in 2016. And the thing with this is that in 2016 we were still counting there was like around 7,000, but like it got so much that people stopped counting. So we don't know the number at the moment. And what was happening during the pandemic, he was using the pandemic to actually tighten more of the restrictions. So I remember when my mom was talking about how it was in 2020, there were checkpoints in every corner. So you have to go, if you're in Manila, you have to visit like 11 checkpoints to wherever you are. So they were using the lockdowns as a way of containing a lot of people and banning a lot of like gatherings for protests. So and this became a little bit the double standard was a lot, especially given that during the protest, this is the police chief. He had a small birthday celebration that defied a lot of the lockdowns. This is a picture of the police captain said he gathered for his small birthday celebration. And when it got leaked to the press, it was like, oh, it's a small mañanita. Now, a mañanita in context is a small birthday party, mostly of immediate family members, and we got this tradition from the Spanish colonial period. So what happened as a result after that? People started doing small mañanita protests in response. So and this is probably one of the biggest ones. This was in UP Diliman. This is like in protest of the terror bill, because the terror bill is a bill that Duterte introduced in order to it's a broad, like they've defined terrorism broadly, and you could pretty much insert activism as terrorism. Anything that like goes against the government is terrorism. So this is the context of the protest. So so that was happening, and the little small mañanita was happening. So this is what people did in reaction. So this was the biggest in UP Diliman, but there were other small mañanitas as well that I was aware of. Like, for example, I know people who held it in Zoom together, apart from other forms that they could think of. I also know some people who use GatherTown, but like one of the more significant ones is the use of Animal Crossing. Now, what's interesting with this is that, like, in the use of Animal Crossing, is that when they were protesting in Animal Crossing, they were also using Animal Crossing to protest like other issues that were also in tie up with like a lot of the tightening of the restrictions and also Duterte's regime. Like, for example, there was a lack of mass testing in the Philippines, and there were no testing kits at all, or mass testing. So people were protesting that alongside the terror bill introduction, and also the phase out of the jeepney. Now, the jeepney is like a form of public transportation in the Philippines, which is more or less like that's being used by more or less privileged people, and that's there were talks about it being phased out. Thankfully, it wasn't, partly because of the protests as well. But like they were using Animal Crossing to also discuss the terror bill, but also to talk about like a lot of these issues that plague a lot of like less privileged communities here. So which is pretty interesting to me, especially given how the Philippine community is still very small, but they were using this. Now, what exactly are we seeing here? As Nathan was pretty much arguing, these are forms of digital sociality, but what we see here too are extensions of more local forms of sociality in digital spaces, like because especially the Mañanita has its traditions, but it became a thing in Animal Crossing, and especially it helps with Animal Crossing. You only have like 8. You can only invite a maximum of 8 people, so it is perfect for a mañanita. So people have been using it there. So we got like the emergent forms of local sociality in these digital spaces, and also we see the use of games as forms of tactical media. And this is significant because Nintendo did not make it to be so, but players are finding ways, and that's awesome, I think. And that's pretty much I think what we need to celebrate, but also keep looking at. Now, so as this is an ongoing study, these are some of the questions that I have specifically, because what I want to do with this is I want to do interviews for this, like and I have some of the questions that I want to tackle, like, for example, how do protester identities link with gamer identities, and especially do protesters specifically identify as gamers at all, even and with the game's use of Twitter and Facebook, because a lot of these protests were put up on Twitter, and people were putting out some of their the codes for their islands on social media. So please join us. Please join us on our little party. So, and what do these imply about games, and especially in connection to connected media ecologies? And also, given how these tactics were not exclusive in the Philippines, of course, some of the first ones that used this is pretty much Hong Kong, and then it was also used in Black Lives Matter. Like, what do these transnational linkages imply about international forms of solidarity, and what do these protesters feel about these other movements? These are things that I kind of want to find out by interviews. And lastly, what do games as global spaces imply about forms of local organization. So like, and there's of course the thing here about like, especially in the Philippines, we have a huge diaspora community. So like there's a like huge transnational exchange happening even within games itself, because like these forms of media are being used to connect people who are within the Philippines and who are in the diaspora. In my case, I'm in the diaspora. I joined some of this as a part of the diaspora. So there are like a lot of conversations here, like with games becoming as part of global spaces. So I'll leave it at that. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. So the next speaker that we'll hear from is Juan He, and Juan will be talking about their work on non-playable characters. So Juan is a assistant professor of English at Vanderbilt University. Recently, formerly, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan's Digital Studies Institute. His research engages Asian American literatures and culture, digital studies, as well as critical game studies. He's currently working on a book project titled The Racial Interface, examining racial associations linking Asian Americans and information technologies. And his research appears or is forthcoming in Configurations, College Literature, a Journal of Critical Literary Studies, Media In, an anthology on Asian American Media In, the journal, and as well as an anthology on Asian American game studies. By the way, Tara Fickle, one of the editors of that, along with Chris Patterson, spoke with us last week. Yeah, Sarah and Matt also have works appearing in that. Not to take away from Juan here, but I just wanted to use that opportunity to celebrate that work coming out. But Juan also writes poetry, which can be found in the journal Poetry, Sewanee Review, A Public Space, Bellwat Poetry Journal, as well as elsewhere. So we'll turn the mic over to Juan to talk about the non-playable character. Thank you.
All right, just give me 1 second to share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see this slide? Oh, I can see my slide through the other image of the in-person room, so I think yes, people can. All right, well, thank you so much, Gerald, for that introduction, and the Games Institute for inviting me, and I'm really happy to be here in conversation with Matthew and Sarah on this panel on Asian American game studies. So I'm taking today to think through some new research, which is drawing from game-based discourse, but to also trace its travel outside of the world of games. So as the central figure of my talk, I'm interested in thinking about the NPC, the non-playable character, as indexing a subject position in digital life, a subject position that I hope to suggest is at times racialized and gendered, not necessarily only in its representation, but also in its logic. I hope in this presentation that you'll get a sense of how I'm thinking about game forms, or more specifically game character forms, as a container for something larger about the relationship in specifically of games in the rise of AI and the kind of use of AI as a kind of technological signifier within the cultural landscape more broadly. So for me, this is part of my own efforts to just make sense of where the collective panic about generative AI is coming from, and what the perspectives and insights of game studies might offer the conversation. So the connection between games and other procedural forms of digital culture has been discussed by scholars such as Tara Fickle, Chris Patterson, Lisa Nakamura, Kashana Gray, Amanda Phillips, and many others. These are just some that came to mind as I was putting together the slides, as well as work on games and AI, such as by Eric Friedman, Artificial Intelligence and Playable Media. So it's within this body of work that I am thinking about some questions in relationship to this new research. What set of meanings does the figure of the NPC offer? How does the racialized and gendered body attune to a type of computational or procedural logic? And why NPC culture, if we can call that a thing, and why now? So I won't necessarily have time today to answer all of these questions in my talk, but they are here to just illustrate the impetus behind some of my thinking in this new research. And I'll begin with some definitional work to ground my conversation, focusing on NPCs as a feature of games, as well as a procedural form that has traveled outside of games into its adjacent cultural realms. So first, what are NPCs? And I think most of you in this audience have a working sense of this, but NPC stands for non-playable characters that are distinct from a player's in-game controllable avatar. This distinction is often defined by the NPC's inability to be controlled or played, rendering NPCs as part of the game narrative, architecture, and world, and even if they can be interacted with. They fill out the game space and make the playing experience dynamic. NPCs in recognizable popular games might include the Pokemon trainers or gym leaders in the Pokemon game franchise, or the Angry Islanders in Animal Crossing. The function of NPCs in games are varied, ranging from allies, enemies, quest givers, service providers, and many more. NPCs originate not necessarily within video games, but can be traced back to the tabletop analog game Dungeons and Dragons, where the game master will control a set of NPCs to create a sense of depth and dimension to the role-playing game experience. So more recently, NPCs have entered new arenas of digital culture, where this particular non-playable form has achieved meme status. And there are a few different notable examples in the past 5-ish years that showcase how the figure of the NPC has become a viral meme. I won't survey all of them. Such as the 2018 use of NPC Twitter bots by the far right to parody liberal, quote, woke discourse. But one recent phenomenon that really caught my attention was the viral sensation of NPC streaming on TikTok, where content creators acted as NPCs for their viewership by enacting a set of pre-programmed responses. These embodied gestures and reactions are in exchange often for microtransactional tips given by the viewers, where part of the interactive component of the live stream was tied into the spectacle generating feedback loop of economically participating in the stream. For example, using an ice cream GIF would yield a response of "ice cream so good," a scripted line that is both sensually suggestive in content and tone, as well as comically effective depending on who you are in the audience. Viewers would also comment on the highly strange experience of these streams, some suggesting that this content was, quote, unreal or cringe, or perhaps reminiscent of a collective social media dystopia akin to the Netflix series Black Mirror. These streams would generate up to thousands of dollars per live stream due to their viral popularity. And here are just a few screen grabs of some popular NPC streams, including images from Pinky Doll and Cherry Crush's live streams. And for the demonstration, I'm just going to show a quick bit of Quebec-based Pinky Doll stream, whose real name is Vera Sinon.
Popcorn, yow, yow, yes, gang, gang. Pop, amazing. Ice cream, so good. Yow, yes, popcorn. Ooh, ice cream, so good. Ooh, yes, popcorn. Oh, take it, baby, this is so cute.
So characteristic of these streams and what makes Pinky Doll an exemplar of NPC streaming is the rhythmic loop in which she syncs her bodily gestures and her scripted lines in conjunction with the stream of viewer tips and donations. While NPCs in games serve many functions and have a much larger procedural function outside of the single screen of interactivity, the streamer's embodiment of an NPC is primarily focused on physicality and gesture, the most notable feature being the soft and often sexualized bouncing that mimic in-game animation of NPCs, and adding dynamism to in-game characters that would otherwise appear overly static or decorative. Embodying a type of character drift within game space transposed onto the streaming environment generates spectacle in the soft motion of digital presence. And the spectacle of being playfully animated becomes quite profitable. I'm fascinated by how a type of digital avatarial production in the form of an NPC elicits a viral social media spectacle vis-a-vis a particular type of performed animatedness. brought forth by enacting repetitive pre-programmed gestures and lines. So of course here I'm also thinking about Sian Nai's notion of animatedness as a racialized affect marked by overexpressivity or inexpressivity, ultimately producing the effect of perceived human agency or inagency or lack of agency. Nai tells us that animatedness uniquely synthesizes divergent relations to expressivity, or what she calls a, quote, peculiar blend of the spontaneous with the formulaic, the unpremeditated with the predetermined, end quote. These antithetical notions of physical agency locate a type of, quote, uncertain territory, end quote, activated by the embodied drift of NPC animation made spectacle, where the viewer is invited to scrutinize the extended labor, often gendered, of live stream performance. NPC blends various digital subcultures together, for example, gaming culture, sex work, and sensorial media such as ASMR content. The faces of the viral meme sensation of NPC streaming are streamers like Pinky Doll and others like Cherry Crush, who often introduces herself as, quote, your very own AI Tamagotchi, end quote, referring to the 90s digital pet craze. Shortly after their popularity, however, the online focus began to shift to the originator of NPC streaming, Natu Koko, a Japanese TikTok creator who began streaming on the social media platform in 2021. In her early streams, Natu Koko embodied the familiar NPC sway and bob, the recognizable animation drift that characterized the in-game presence of a digital figure. Her signature gray cat ears, doll-like makeup, and her playful roboticism were a constant throughout the various NPC personas that she has portrayed, drawing from Japanese cosplay and anime culture. I'll also just show a really quick clip of Natu Koko's NPC TikTok content, this one being a non-live stream. So many things are quite striking about the visual components of NPC personification itself, and I'm happy to think through this further in the Q&A. However, for today, I'm interested in thinking through what these examples of NPC streaming, particularly as they surround Natu Koko's distinctly Japanese expression of NPCs, means in the age of AI technologies and discourse. While conversations surrounding Natu Koko's NPC stream often focused on topics reminiscent of cultural erasure or content appropriation, arguing for Natu Koko as the original NPC streamer from Japan instead of the North American streamers, I'm fascinated by how Natu Koko's Japaneseness is coextensive with what one user has called her as the, quote, original AI queen, end quote. How might we locate Natu Koko's Japaneseness in her NPC portrayal, not exclusively in the explicit racial markers and visual culture references to globalized Japanese cosplay culture, but perhaps in the gestural acts of computational procedure, programmability, and the shifting line of human agential expression? So we see a move toward these covert logics of the NPC within Natu Koko's own narration of her work. In an interview with Insider Magazine that followed Pinky Doll's high-profile article with the New York Times, Natu Koko reveals her motivations behind her NPC streaming strategy. She describes the intention behind her live streams as, quote, a thought experiment with her viewers and followers, stimulating her audience in new ways and transforming her body into a screen of projected fantasy. She draws analogy from the art world, likening the figural form of the NPC to that of a statue, saturated by the mystical aura of aesthetic experience and perception. She states, to return to the example of statues, it's like I'm a piece of art in the museum. You don't need to know information about the art to enjoy it. You just stop and look at it and start to maybe look at it from different angles and learn what you like about it yourself. What Natu Koko suggests about the body-turned NPC is the relationship between flesh and thing rendered in constructed pixelated space, reminiscent of an Asiatic femininity that Anne Eileen Chen would call ornamentalism. Tracing a genealogy of racialized personhood, ornamentalism indexes the longer history in which the gendered Asiatic persons have been constructed through, quote, a decorative grammar, end quote, an aesthetic project of destructive humanization by rendering the body abstract. Nagikoko's playful NPC embodiment recalls this aesthetic legacy of personhood rendered synthetic and race coextensive with the artificial spectacle. Her virtual performance bridges personhood and objecthood, opening up a conceptual space in which her Asianness is marked by a particular style or procedure of digital activity, rather than a marker of biological or cultural authenticity or inauthenticity. And here I'm also thinking alongside Christopher Patterson's theorization of the Asiatic in global game cultures, as well as work by Lisa Nakamura and Tara Fickle in regards to Chinese gold farmers in World of Warcraft who attracted online racism and vitriol for playing as a laboring, unfun NPC for profit. While Chinese gold farmers in game worlds were despised, these NPCs on social media are generally celebrated even if they're not fully understood, at least in the results of fame and profit. Perhaps all of this is my attempt to try to make sense of two coinciding phenomena that I've been tracking: the virality of NPC streaming, a spectacle in the social media sphere, alongside the rise of generative AI. With the scrutinization of a playful robotic animation typical of NPC personification, I found myself quite unsurprised that the quest to locate the originator of the viral meme yielded a Japanese content creator. Yet to identify the originator of NPC streaming as Japanese or Asian was less about locating a cultural origin, but more about how Japaneseness facilitates a particular relationship to AI-rendered spectacle. As a racial form with ludic qualities, the non-playable character indexes the close affinity between AI as algorithmic process and person. And this portable cosplay animation of becoming an NPC foregrounds the digital subject positions emerging in the uncanny valley of inscrutability, typical in the kind of slow integration of AI interfaces into everyday interactions. What I mean here is that as AI has become more commonplace as a technical object, we find ourselves sharpening our interpretive tools of discernment by training ourselves to tell human expression or creativity from its AI-generated forms. Eric Friedman reminds us that the focus on AI is not a call to study the technical infrastructures of playable media and abandon their formal devices, visual tropes, and narrative pleasures. We should also pay equal attention to computation, representation, and interaction, and understand the interdependent layers of digital media. As a cultural representation of an increasingly AI-enveloped world, NPC personification renders the fantasy of AI into a playable form, in which the dominant interaction of scrutinization becomes pleasurable and in some cases monetizable. Especially since the category of the NPC functions as a pan-genre game form, the figure of the NPC both depends on and eschews its Asiatic residue, drawing from a cultural lexicon of a gendered Asian roboticism, but also animated in different ways. As Natsuko narrates, it's become part of the culture in a way and has established a certain genre of communicating with people. Attuned to the way her NPC performance activates a particular genre of communication, Natsuko reflection suggests that NPCs as a cultural form of communication might be situated within the landscape of AI interactivity that draws from but moves beyond the realm of games. While part of how I'm locating Asianness might suggest the techno-orientalist underpinnings of NPC's playful roboticism, I'm not necessarily interested in identifying a new category of techno-orientalism in the form of the NPC. The NPC is recognizable as an embodied set of algorithmically rendered gestures because it trains viewers to find pleasure in scrutinizing the portrayal of artificial personhood and the labors behind sustaining its representations. The scrutinization, which might be where I locate the procedural logic of Asianness, is entangled within the larger collective interaction with AI technologies more broadly. The collective fascination with NPC streaming is one example that attempts to negotiate the cultural anxieties attending the inscrutability of technological power within the fast-growing category of AI, where AI's kind of meaninglessness, its flexibility as a signifier allows it to travel to various tech industries, including games, social media streaming, and even the curious category of Web3 technologies. The phenomenon of NPC streaming might offer clues for how race manifests as logic within the rise of what some might call AI culture, the blend of AI generation as technologically inflected forms of cultural expression spanning all sorts of media objects. The search for the origins of NPC streaming, for instance, which yielded the fame of Natokoko for a Western social media audience, reflects a narrative impulse to situate the unbelievability of technologically compromised human expression within a familiar and situated cultural narrative of globalized Japanese aesthetics. Reminiscent of a, quote, "where did this come from" line of questioning that locates a foreignness within the performance of digital personhood, the origin status of Natokoko as the original NPC, which is her tagline in her TikTok bio, attempts to familiarize the otherwise strangeness of AI personification. And there are fascinating parallels between trends of tech discourse that attempt to make sense of the strange newness of ChatGPT when it arrived on the scene, as evidenced by MIT Technology Review's headline, "ChatGPT is everywhere. Here's where it came from." So here, as I just round out some of my preliminary thoughts for today, we might find ourselves a little unmoored from the digital world of games, yet I hope to suggest that game studies, especially Asian Americanist approaches to game studies, might have lots to offer the broader conversation about AI culture as it is quickly emerging and shifting. This is especially true as digital games as an industry have been at the forefront of new technological innovation, from VR to the role of AI within game worlds, where AI has been used increasingly to experiment with the interactive capacities of NPCs. The critical lexicon developed by Asian American studies of racialization might allow us to better understand these new genres of communication that require us not to locate Asianness within a particular cultural or aesthetic skin, but in the procedural animation that circulate broadly within the horizon of innovation and the technologically new. And I'll end there. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Juan, for that talk. There's some questions in the chat, but we're going to save all that for the end once all the speakers have had a chance to talk. And so I'll introduce our final speaker. Mac Junso-Kauer is an assistant professor at Loyola University, Chicago School of Communication. And I'm going to interrupt the introduction again to give a little bit more context. When I asked these folks to be on this panel of emerging scholars in Asian American game studies, I knew them as postdocs and PhD students. So I'm just incredibly pleased to see them appearing 3 months later, all as assistant professors at wonderful institutions. But yeah, Matt Howard is an assistant professor at Loyola University Chicago School of Communication. He writes Gyeopo media histories that explore the intertwinement of the Korean wave of globalized circulation of South Korean popular culture in peninsular diasporas, particularly in North America. He is particularly interested in media cultural histories of race, ethnicity, and nationality, and has published in the Journal of Games Criticism, ROMChip, the Journal of Games History, as well as the Esports Yearbook. When he's not spoiling all of our favorite entertainment forms, Matt can be found chasing his step pug Morty around the house, sneaking treats to his baby conjure Jenny, and withering under Goober the cat's disdainful gaze. And Matt will talk to us today about how do heels and global immobilities in Professional League of Legends, Gyeopro media history. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks so much for having me here, y'all. I'm really excited to talk about Hallyu heels and global immobilities in Professional League of Legends as Gyeopro media history. Just to sort of map the intellectual trajectory here, I'm really fascinated by the intersection of Chen Guanxing's work, Asia's method toward de-imperialization, and his sort of drive to produce new epistemic reference points from the, I guess, post-colonial imperial periphery. with the question of how we can think about what that might do or might not do in the case of ethnic minorities and minoritized populations living within sort of the imperial metropoles, right? So this this project continues my longtime fascination with a probably the weirdest governance struggle that I've ever seen in gaming and sort of esports spaces. And I guess if we follow Tarfickel's theory of Ludo-Orientalism and say, okay, Asian American racialization is heavily driven by logics of games, where else could we go except amendments to the game rules, right? So let's get started here. The first thing I want to say is that you cannot understand professional League of Legends and region locking and the sort of Korean question in professional law without understanding the 2005 WWE rivalry between Randy Orton and The Undertaker. And this is not just a plug in everything is wrestling bit. This rivalry sort of pitted Randy Orton as he was coming up in wrestling against The Undertaker, who's sort of this established powerhouse. It played them off against each other and climactically culminated in one match where Randy Orton and his dad threw The Undertaker into a coffin and lit on fire, and then the following match where The Undertaker's disembodied voice started calling out, "Hello, Randy," throughout the stadium, and Randy Orton starts running around freaked out, right? Ultimately, this is profit-driven by pitting the sort of plucky underdog young gun against the man who's basically like a weird undead Lich King within WWE's lore, right? This sort of all-powerful, otherworldly force. And I'm arguing here that this is reproduced in professional League of Legends competitive landscape, particularly because the entire thing orbits around a sort of World Cup style tournament at the end of every year, which just concluded this year. So I had to rapidly throw in at the bottom here that T1 3-0'd Weibo Gaming. Sorry for the spoilers if you were waiting to watch those recordings, but this had to be done. So if you look over this, there's not really a whole lot to tell you one way or another. So here are some quick summaries on who has appeared in the grand finals of the World Championship and who has won according to LOL's, like, I guess, regionalization through its local regional leagues. At the top, we have South Korea, now with 14 finals appearances across various teams. 8 times they've taken home the title, and 6 times, including the very first Worlds they ever appeared at, they were the runners-up. Following that, you have China in the LPL, 6 finals appearances, 3 titles, 3-time runners-up. They were actually the first region to have a team beat and eliminate a South Korean, the last South Korean team from the World Championship, and therefore sort of stand in the way of yet another victory for the evil empire, right? Third here, we have, they've now rebranded as the EMEA. It used to just be EU for Europe. They've appeared 4 times in the finals. They've taken home 1 title, and it was the first one when it was only Europe and North America. And they've been runners-up 3 times. We then have sort of a generalized weird conglomerate APAC region that typically consists of Vietnam, Malaysia, and sometimes Hong Kong and Macau, which kind of get phased in and out of their own separate thing. They've appeared once, and that was in 2012 when the Taipei Assassins beat the Korean overlords in their first appearances. North America's there too, but they haven't done anything. So as you can see here, the now, I guess, 12-year-long, 13-year-long professional League of Legends history has heavily been characterized by the victories of East Asian and particularly South Korean teams over those of basically everyone else, right? And there were points in time where if, like me, you were trying real hard to find something to hope for as a North American esports fan, it was rough, right? I mean, that that 2013 to 2017 stretch was very bad, especially since you hit this point where you were having, for 3 straight years, South Korean team versus South Korean team in these grand finals, right? Makes it tough to root for. And this is how I would sort of parlay this into some of this connective work historically, right? We need to not just, I know that there is a need for specificity when it comes to talking about particular esports and particular esports histories, but we have to be careful, right? We have to be careful how much we break them apart from each other, right? And in this case, the sort of I guess the world's results are indicative of a longer history and a longer kind of question for Riot Games, League of Legends developer, which I here call the Korean problem, in sort of an homage to the Japan problem pointed out by Robbins and Morley in their OG piece on techno-orientalism, right? And in a 2016 book by journalist Roland Lee, Lee pointed out in a chapter talking broadly about this Korean problem that, in particular, StarCraft 2 and StarCraft 1 had really, as esports ecosystems, struggled to simultaneously support sort of neoliberal free competition between whoever defined the best players and the ability to market their esports as sort of narratively driven, resonant, profit-generating systems, right? I quote Lee here to say that StarCraft 2 had, at a certain point, a homogenous cast of competitors and deadened interest from some Americans and Europeans, aka white people largely, right, who didn't have a local player to root for, right? Many Koreans also couldn't give interviews in English, and spoke with respect towards opponents instead of talking trash, which made for weak drama. And most of the Korean players had meek personas. Now, apart from being this sort of reiteration of, robotic Asian techno-orientalism stuff, this maps out the central question that I think Riot Games recognized pretty early on that they were going to have to contend with. They had a Korean problem. What would happen if South Korean players started going to other regions like they had in StarCraft, competing, stomping the absolute crap out of everybody local, and establishing themselves as sort of overlords of these various regional scenes where they sort of are assumed not to belong, right? And their solution was to monetize it, right? Not to solve it initially. So as Lily Zhu argues, right, the sort of international viability of League of Legends esports is built around pitting this sort of East versus West narrative, pitting this sort of disenfranchised white game creator versus the Asian other who takes the game, turns it into a professional esport, turns it into work, turns it into a job that they're just better at inherently on some level, and turns it into an underdog story, right? Where the profit-driving motive isn't, or like the means of profit production isn't built around like North America and Europe having a fair shot, right? It's actually built around North America being trash. It's built around this sort of reiterative, are you trying harder? Is there a sense that the gap between Korea and the rest of the world is closing? Is there a sense that you're making progress in terms of putting up a good fight, right? It pits your South Korea as Undertaker against your plucky Randy Orton who needs help from his dad in EU and NA, right? It pits them against each other. And that's how professional League of Legends produces drama. At least until 2014, right? In 2014, we have what's called the Korean exodus within the League of Legends community, where I would say somewhere between a third and half of the players from the South Korean Regional League left South Korea, right? And all of a sudden the Korean problem and its resonance with Yellow Peril is kind of realized. This is an example I just could find on the internet, and this is a 2014 spring matchup in the Chinese LPL League, right? And you'll notice that both teams are fielding Korean players, right? And at the time, Imp, Flame, and Spirit were considered like peak players at their positions, right? And the sort of running narrative was that they were leaving because the wage opportunities on the peninsula were crappy, and so they went elsewhere to make more money, right? But I mean, we're talking about like somewhere between 20 and 30 players, pros, leaving that league and going international. And it wasn't just to China, it was also to North America and Europe, Brazil, and all over the place, right? So what does Riot do? At this point, monetizing the Korean problem only goes so far, right? And as Gerald and I have talked about in our chapter in the edited volume that everyone on this panel is in, we talk about how sort of appropriating Koreanness and bringing aspects of Koreanness over to North America and to Europe is seen as this sort of best practice for white survival in a kind of techno-orientalist apocalyptic future, right? Riot here kind of steps in to say, okay, yes, but also we need to regulate this so that we don't run into what StarCraft ran into. And their solution is what's called region locking, where according to the rules of the World Championship Tournament, which had the biggest prize pool in the entire professional scene, you had to have 3 of your starting 5 players in any given match have residency established in the region that the team was affiliated with. So if you were in North America, you had to have 3 US or Canadian players, basically, right? Or people with proof of citizenship or permanent residency. Yes, it outlines those in the rule book, right? Starting out of your 5 starters, right? Only two of your people could be Korean in this case, right? So all of a sudden we have these sort of limits placed, right, in a very weird kind of yucky, not quite explicitly Korean Exclusion Act, right? Because there were already Europeans moving around, right? And when that was happening, nobody really cared, right? But when the Koreans started leaving the peninsula en masse, all of a sudden we have region locking coming in. This is, again, within the rule book, nominally sort of this like very legalese contracty document, situated as a kind of is situated quite openly rhetorically as this like, we're going to help everybody grow and preserve the sort of worldsness, right? The sort of like multicultural globality of the World Championship here, by enacting this sort of, by basically enacting immigration quotas, right? This is a weird thing. I don't know. It sticks in my mind, right? And it also kind of didn't work because over time you have this continued flow of South Korean labor out of the peninsula and into other regions. These are both graphs taken for North America that show, you know, increasing numbers of quote unquote foreign players and also increasing numbers of Korean players flowing into the North American Regional League, despite the fact that, you know, in sort of after the sort of summer 2014, winter 2014 period, we have that region locking stamp in place. This, I would argue, turns out to be kind of a part of a broader regulatory solution to the Korean problem for Riot Games, which is, number one, enacted through region locking in 2014. In 2014-15, they also eliminate the eligibility of what are called sister teams, which were pretty much just a Korean, I guess, practice, where most of the big corporate organizations that were sponsoring teams would sponsor 2, so that you would have consistent, really high quality practice partners in-house, right? And it got to the point where we had, like, I think in the quarters or semifinals of Worlds 2014, Samsung White and Samsung Blue going head to head in this really like vicious and tremendous match as sort of, you know, sporting spectacle. But I guess for Riot it was a bit of a headache, so they said no more sister teams, right? One organization cannot fund two teams within that league. There was a change to the LCK, sort of Korea's professional law league's temporality. They had been running on sort of a trimester or quarter system, for lack of a better way of putting it, and they were pushed to align with the rest of the world in terms of having sort of a spring and summer season only. So winter tournaments were eliminated as part of that. And then in 2016, Riot went and patched out what they basically called a boring and formulaic game mechanic that just happened to be a game mechanic that South Korean teams had invented and had gotten significantly better at than sort of North America in particular at executing in game. So to me, this sort of maps out, right, a longer agenda of kind of keeping the Korean Undertaker under control, or if we recall my Photoshop job, the Underfaker, right? But what does this whole like nerfing Korea, region locking history have to do with Asian American game studies, right? As I said before, this is sort of founded in this sort of the Ludo-Orientalist question of how is this games, right? And what happens when we start to see the rules of games change, and how does that affect racialization? But it's also important to keep in perspective here, because to me, the one really interesting group of excluded people as sort of like, I don't know, like on the mind of the people writing these rules within professional League of Legends are Asian Americans, right? We regularly see a heavy representation of East Asian American men on esports teams as players, as coaches, what have you. And this sort of region locking policy is instituted specifically to try and curtail certain forms of Asian immigration related to esports labor. It brings us to this, I guess, theorization of mine of Gyeopogam and Gyeopo media. Gyeopo is a generally kind of derogatory Korean language word for used to refer to diaspora, particularly Korean peninsular diasporas who've, you know, gone off elsewhere. I believe that the English translation is basically sojourner. So we're talking about this conceptualization of the person who left the peninsula as this sort of like pleasure traveler on some level, right? Who has lost touch with their true Koreanness, their cultural roots, and their sort of fidelity to the project of post-colonial South Korean like nationalist recovery from Japanese occupation. Gam as a suffix refers to a certain feeling of or a hunch of something. So in this case, we're dealing with sort of the feeling or hunch of Gyeopo-ness. And I argue that this is sort of a historical inheritance that's tied up in all of these sort of threads of racialization, building national identity, ethnicity, and contending with sort of tensions between the global and the local. It's both a semblance that people do to other people and an affective response that people like me do as individuals, right? And it positions the model minority and perpetual foreigner as sort of a trans-Pacific bind, right? It breaks it out of sort of the political borders of the US and Canada. And in this case, part of this project is reconciling, I guess, Asian Americanness and it with, I guess, what I would call sort of a minoritized longue durée, which refers to this school of history where basically they wanted to contend with interplaying temporalities and spatialities back in like the 40s and 50s before people thought about history that way. And their argument was basically that like we need to contend with the ways that like climate time and geologic time can affect the sort of flare-up watershed historical events that we run into, right? And so I would argue that these questions of gyopogam and this feeling of like being Asian American and also being this like, you know, sojourner nationalism trader is sort of bound up in a longer set of histories than perhaps we initially read. Which means that we're kind of intertwining back into this loop of, I guess, Asian racialization through a relationship between play and labor, right? We recall Tarfickel's arguments about Ludo-Orientalism and sort of the construction of race and racialization alongside gamic logics. But here we also see sort of longer term enactments of racialized materiality, right? So in this case, I would argue that sort of the K or the Koreanness that we're seeing is the undertaker. And so it's this essential profit-producing resource for professional League of Legends in that they need their heel, they need their bad guy to be there, to loom, to be better at the game than the white people, so that when they win, you know, it's a big deal. But the flip side is that Gyopogam and Gyopodo, so like Gyopo as like people objects within this framework, represent both essential labor and yellow peril simultaneously, right? This reiterates that long-term Asian American like ambivalent racialization, where you're both the tool that is going to help North America beat the Undertaker, and you are the threat to North American jobs and indeed to the very livelihood of the entire esports, the esport as industry, as ecosystem, right? And I think that considering these contexts of Gyopogam and Gyopodo sort of brings Asian America into the gaming and esports conversation in important and as of yet kind of minimally explored ways, right? Like, who are the Asian Americans that Riot Games does not feel a whole lot of impetus to define within their rules? They don't care, right? You are almost rendered immaterial in that way racially. You're just part of Randy Orton, right? Like you're definitely not part of the Undertaker. You're just part of Randy Orton, but you're like, I don't know, like his wrist or something, right? You're sort of, nobody's looking at Randy Orton's wrists while he does his RKO move on people, right? You're looking at Randy Orton as a character, as sort of this flattened North America doing battle against the Korean Undertaker menace, right? So I think there's just an interesting interplay of sort of racialization and materiality there that's worth us continuing to contend with. And here are just some central important works I like for doing this research. And yeah, thanks so much. That'll do it.
All right, thank you so much, Matthew. And thank you again to Sarah and Juan for some great talks, for some really interesting ideas putting some really interesting ideas on the table to stimulate some thinking, and as well as some conversation. We have about 20 minutes left for that conversation, for some questions and discussion from the audience and amongst the panelists as well. And so I'd like to turn to some of the questions that have already popped up in the chat, and start there. And so I am noting that the first couple of questions that were directed to Sarah did take a stab at addressing them in the chat, and I wonder, Sarah, if there's anything that you'd like to add. So the questions were from Aiden and from Daniela regarding participant safety, and um, um, how the protests materialized on Animal Crossing versus how they might have materialized on other digital platforms such as Twitter or X or other social media. And I'm wondering if there's anything you want to add to what you've already noted, or if you're, yeah, I just give you the opportunity to expand on that if you'd like.
Yeah, it's I think one of the things that I probably would just highlight is the fact that, like, with, especially when it comes to various platforms, they both create discourse, right? So one, but like they present different forms of like presenting. Like, for example, and as different forms of media, they highlight different things. Like, for example, with Twitter, it's easy to highlight particular conversations, and it's, as a researcher, it's easier to follow certain threads of these conversations. But like with Animal Crossing, there's like this spectacle element that's there more, because like I've seen people burn effigies in these things. So there's like there's that heightened element of the creation of spectacle, even in these just in these small spaces. But also, like, it's interesting to me how, like, in concerning safety, it's like there were people who have various forms of publicity. And also, like, I have to note the fact that, like, Facebook and Twitter are a little bit different in the Philippines, like, because like I know people who are much more comfortable posting on Twitter than Facebook, because Facebook is much more heavily controlled by the Duterte government, whereas Twitter is a little bit less controlled. So people are surprisingly much bolder on Twitter. So it's important to take note of that, but also, like, understanding the different forms of visibilities. And this is one thing I have to note as a researcher, because one thing I'd want to do is I'd want to conduct interviews with this in order to move this forward. So, and that's in my ethics form, actually, but also with, like, these forms of participation, these things disappear. So a lot of our work here is like to pretty much also document these forms of resistances, as I've said. So, like, yeah, those are things I want to highlight. So yeah.
Great, thank you for elaborating on that a little bit. So the next question I'm seeing in the chat, and feel free to also raise your virtual hand on the interface if you'd like to turn on your mic and ask a question to the presenters live. I'm happy to recognize those questions as well. But just in the absence of that, turning to the next question in the chat from Catherine for Juan. Thank you for sharing wonderful work on the racial logics behind NPCs. Could you please elaborate more on what effects do game developers' racial identities have on NPCs as they are portrayed in terms of race? I'm trying to conduct research on the use of generative AI in programming NPCs, examining if AI inadvertently perpetuates racial stereotypes in games. Could you share more of your opinions about this, if this is something that you could think about? Thank you.
Now, this is a great question, and I think kind of the direction in which I'm hoping to move some of this research in terms of thinking about the use of AI to generate NPCs. I mean, off the top of my head, I mean, in terms of this question of racial identities, I feel like a lot of, at least some of the examples that I've seen in kind of tech discourse about companies using, AI such as ChatGPT have been, for example, NetEase, a Chinese gaming company or gaming developer, in their kind of mobile game Justice Online. And part of that, it's super interesting when you think about that as in kind of a non-US context, in the sense of this ChatGPT being implemented almost kind of as a, I think, kind of a branding boost, and as a kind of form of spectacle to render the game itself like dynamic. Like, hey, we have ChatGPT being able to make our games kind of being one of the games that's almost a kind of a test case for AI within making the kind of game space dynamic. So I mean, in terms of that example, like, I'm not very optimistic about the kind of plug and play use of ChatGPT in games. It seems kind of more like perhaps like a marketing ploy in a lot of different cases. I mean, we know how bad ChatGPT is with handling topics or issues related to race. It's like the one thing that kind of can really expose ChatGPT, as something that is perhaps AI, clearly AI. I mean, if you look at, I teach a lot of classes that, look at race as a topic, and I'm not really concerned about students using ChatGPT to answer some of these questions because it's just so bad at handling race. So I mean, I don't really know the whole, what the kind of future of it will look like, but I'm not necessarily confident in terms of the kind of just easy kind of plug and play approach of using AI within game development. I don't think that they would actually, do anything in terms of rectifying racial stereotypes, if I'm understanding the question correctly. But I would love to hear more about the research that you're doing, Catherine. It sounds really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you, Juan. Let's see. So we do have another question. This one for Matt, and I'm going to go out and say that I have no idea what is being referenced in this question. But I'm eager to hear your thoughts on it, Matthew. I hope you probably have greater familiarity with these ideas and trends. So Sarah says, great presentation on the behind the scenes of the professional LOL. Do you think that Riot's views on the domination of Korean players in League of Legends has shifted with the growing international popularity of Faker and other K cultures, thinking about KDA and the New Jeans World Song?
Oh yeah, thanks so much for this this question. Riot's like weird sidebar as like music video production company is something that I think is really interesting and generally understudied as well. But like, I guess I would say that I don't know, because to me, I guess part of the project of my work is actually trying to situate professional esports as part of Hallyu and the Korean wave, because I think that can be really generative in terms of thinking about the ways that like you have these playouts of racial and ethnic and sort of national logics that are happening within all of these. But I think that overwhelmingly, the social media response I've seen so far around the T1 win this year was like this celebration specifically of Faker, almost to the exclusion of like literally every other player, even just on his team, because he's been playing for so long and he's been at this for so long that the average esports career is like a year or two, and he's now won a world championship in his 10th year of professional play. So, it is incredible, but also I wonder whether there's kind of a like high-tech orientalist datification of race as like, okay, we like K-pop, okay, we like Faker, but I'm not sure whether we like the widespread systemic factors and cultural factors that may lead to really good professional South Korean gamers, right? And I'm not sure that Riot has reached a point where they're like okay with how the scene is going, because ultimately the teams that are winning when the Koreans aren't winning are the Chinese. And I mean, I'm sure that plays well with Tencent, who basically owns them, but like, NA still sucks, right? So I would be interested in what some of that more recent discourse kind of looks like. I forgot to put the historian's hedge in of putting a start date, end date on my talk. So I'm maybe a little bit less tuned into like the 2021 through 2023 stuff. But yeah, to me, it reads more as like selective, this is good, this other stuff bad, than it does of like a broader acceptance of Koreanness.
All right, thank you, Matthew, for situating that, and in your own work and in the cultural production that's going on right now as well. So we have another question in chat from, oops, I accidentally just closed down the chat. Here we go. So we have another question in chat from Aiden for Juan as well. Aiden says, thank you for the presentation. I'm really interested in the human NPC streamers' adoption of communication styles modeled on non-human digital approximations of humans. It seems that they're purposefully selecting the types of NPCs that are less detailed and more quote-unquote uncanny valley, the type that, as you mentioned, may be generated algorithmically. In generative AI, I've been thinking a lot about the often unknowable source of excuse me, thinking a lot about the often unknowable sources that LLM chatbots are trained on, language learning model chatbots are trained on. Much of it I expect but can't confirm, coming from websites written by humans to cater to search engines using search engine optimization strategies. That's really interesting. So we've got algorithms learning how to write like humans by studying humans that are writing to cater to algorithms. What do you make of these phenomena together? Is there a racialized dimension to the language learning models' recursive blurring of the lines between human and machine communication? What a wonderful question. Thank you so much for that. Juan, this is directed to you.
Yeah, no, this is a great question and a lot to think about. And you're absolutely right that these kind of NPC personifications are quite they are very much a spectacle. They're about performing this kind of uncanny valley that is very much, indicative of this kind of feedback loop of LLM chatbots, as you're mentioning, of like human machine expression kind of algorithmically mashed up. I feel like, I'm not sure if there is a racialized dimension to it, but I think what's interesting is that, that this is also kind of a strategic move by these streamers to kind of recognize and insert oneself as, kind of find a profit-generating model on a platform such as TikTok that doesn't necessarily reward its streamers and content creators in a kind of, satisfactory way. And the fact that, streamers such as Pinky Doll and Cherry Crush have kind of found their way in by enacting the kind of live stream of being able to kind of directly interact with their viewers and being able to, generate thousands of dollars through this kind of perfected, kind of algorithmic behavior that's very reminiscent of an NPC, I think is really fascinating. It's kind of a strategic kind of way of embodying a kind of algorithmically produced human in a kind of algorithm space that doesn't necessarily value the content that they otherwise be creating. So this is something that I'm also thinking about as a other kind of possible direction for this research, is thinking about the ways in which this kind of algorithmic personhood is a way to insert oneself within an already established social media algorithm to kind of, I guess, make profit, but also just to kind of find new ways of creating value in a space that doesn't necessarily value the type of work that you do. So those are just some thoughts. I am very intrigued by the last question. Is there a racialized dimension to this recursive blurring? I'm not exactly sure, but in many ways, LLMs just in general are, I want to think more about that last question.
Yeah, thanks for starting to think about that with us. What a great question as well. So we only have a few more minutes, but hopefully we can hear another question for both Sarah and Matt. We'll try to see about that. There's a question from Christine for Sarah. Amazing work. How do citizen protests in Animal Crossing converse with AC mobilizations that happen by those who own the means of political production. For example, the Biden-Harris Islands in the 2020 election campaign. Yeah, so can you talk about that context and that meeting, if you would?
Yeah, I think I could because like Kamala Harris and Joe Biden during their campaign, what they did was they pretty much like created an island so that people could come in for their campaign. So people in Animal Crossing could just come in and see like post like I didn't see that one, but like I saw the NDP version though because like I know Jagmeet Singh in the NDP also had his own island. It was super orange, but it's and I find that really fascinating. But it's a really interesting point and also a really good question, especially given how like people who have the means of political production have pretty much like used this. So I think it's important to note here like the dates of when these were happening because the protests were happening around like earlier in the spring like but then you see this happen like these forms of appropriation happening around like October, November, and then like the year after when there was another election, Canadian election. That's like so. I think what we're seeing here is how like those with the means are appropriating this, but also we have to think about like what's more regulated. Like for example, with the Hong Kong protests, like Nintendo had to ban the use of Winnie the Pooh in these protests because like people have been using it as a like as a substitute for like President Xi Jinping, but it's important to note how there were those restrictions with like the Hong Kong protests and also like in the Philippines it didn't really happen, but like there was a fear of like okay, what they could ban something too here. So there's that, but like with this kind of appropriation, I don't think there's much of a danger of anything being like banned or something. So yeah.
Yeah, they enjoy very different privileges of access and security around their protected speech. Yeah, that's thanks for putting those considerations on the table for us, Sarah. And I think that we've got 2 minutes left. I'm going to try to squeeze this one in. This question comes from Neil Randall, and it's for the director of the GI. And the question is for Matt. Given interest in esports from the Olympics, is there discussion happening now on how the IOC, FIFA, etc., have dealt with local team dominance in other international sports over the decades? Thinking particularly of dominance in USA in basketball, when it began as an Olympic sport, Canada in hockey in the 40s and 50s, US women's soccer until pretty much the last World Cup. And there's some other examples in here as well. But the question is waiting for the rest of the world to catch up a viable strategy in esports, or is this entirely different? Maybe because so much depends on Riot, for example, that it can't work as a waiting situation. So yeah, what's going to happen when we see esports as an Olympic event, and are there differences in that framework versus the commercial proprietary framework that Riot has set up for themselves with LOL, for instance?
I think this is a fascinating question because it plays into this sort of like longue durée issue, right? Like what happens when we sort of dovetail the histories of esports with histories of sort of IOC regulation and FIFA and that sort of thing. And frankly, I'm not tuned in enough into some of the sport historical contexts of the IOC and FIFA to give you a solid answer on that front. On the weighting end, I think this idea that like trickle down would work in esports, I think I would argue that if it does shift things, it's not going to shift things because Riot decided they were gonna like just let things percolate, right? Like I'd be really curious about how soaring property values and household debt will affect South Korean esports. I'm interested in how, like, if we think about professional League of Legends within contexts of like the longue durée of Empire, right? That maybe shifts some things. I'm not sure whether in a vacuum esports history is going to shift a whole lot because of esports history things per se. However you want to draw that sort of, I guess, disciplinary border. But thanks for that question, because yeah, that's some cool stuff to think through.
Well, thank you for starting to think through that with us, Matt. And And as we wrap it up here, I want to thank everybody who came out to listen to these talks with such great questions and conversation. There's actually another question in the chat from Johan O. We're not going to have time for it, unfortunately. We are a little bit over time as it is, but it's a really great question for Juan about the distinction between NPCs that are there for an emotional bond versus NPCs that are there just for purely instrumental gameplay functions. And Juan, I hope that helps you think through your ideas a little bit more as well. So thank you for all the great questions and discussion from our guests today, but also thank you, Sarah, Juan, and Matthew, for your wonderful talks and for some insights into some emerging questions and some emerging issues in the field, the growing field of Asian American game studies. It's been a real treat to hear from you, and everybody look forward to future events in the speaker series. There's a couple of events in December around Indigenous issues in game studies and game development. The workshop, unfortunately, is an in-person workshop, but on December 12th, Megan Burns, notable Canadian Indigenous game designer, will be giving a talk about indigeneity representation. So do look forward to that. You can check out the listing on the Games Institute website, but also look out for and look forward to what Sarah, Juan, and Matt are saying and publishing in the next few years. They really are doing some amazing work that's linking game studies with communication, political communication and culture, American studies, cultural studies broadly, and I really look forward to seeing them develop and flourish in their careers as well. So one last virtual or real round of applause for our speakers, if you will, and thank you all so very much.